When I came back from my father's deathbed, I found my husband had changed the locks on our $100 million condo, and my clothes were already in garbage bags by the curb. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. It was late evening when I arrived in Manhattan, exhausted after 2 weeks in Boston. My father had taken his last breath just 3 days ago, and I had barely slept since. All I wanted was to walk into my home, take a hot shower, and finally cry in peace. But when I tried my key in the door, it didn't fit. I tried again. It was useless. The doorman, a man I'd known for years, wouldn't even meet my eyes. "Mrs. Mercer, you're not on the lease anymore," he said, his tone robotic. My heart froze. "That can't be right," I whispered, my voice trembling. He just nodded toward the curb. There, lined up neatly beside a row of glossy black trash bins, were my suitcases, my clothes, my things, my life. I stood there on the cold marble floor of the lobby, still holding the useless key in my hand. People passed by, glancing but pretending not to stare. It felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My husband, Cole Mercer, wasn't answering his phone. My texts went unread. The last message he'd sent me was, "Take your time with your dad. Don't worry about me." I tried calling the security office, thinking it was a mistake. It wasn't. "Mr. Mercer requested the locks be changed yesterday," they said. "He left instructions not to allow you entry." I remember laughing, a sharp, broken sound that didn't even sound like me. Cole was a man who built towers that touched the skyline. He could charm investors, politicians, anyone. But I never thought he'd do this to me. Not after 6 years of marriage. Not when he knew I had no one else left. My father was gone. My mother had died when I was a teenager. I had always believed Cole was my family. That night, I sat on the curb beside those garbage bags, watching the city lights blur through tears. I had no idea why he did it. No warning, no fight, no reason. Just silence and betrayal. And as the wind picked up around me, I realized one thing. This wasn't an accident. It was planned. And I was going to find out why. I was still sitting on the lobby floor when the elevator doors opened, and Cole finally appeared. He looked untouched by everything that had shattered me. His suit perfect, his hair in place, his expression carved out of ice. For a second, I thought he might reach for me, ask what happened, tell me it was a mistake. But he didn't. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, staring at me like I was a stranger who'd wandered into his building. "Laura," he said, calm and smooth, "you shouldn't be here." I stared at him, trying to understand what was happening. "You changed the locks. You threw my things out like trash. What is wrong with you?" My voice cracked halfway through, but he didn't flinch. He exhaled, like he'd rehearsed this conversation in his head a dozen times already. "You left, Laura. You walked away when I needed you most. I had to make decisions for my life and my company." I blinked. "I left because my father was dying." He tilted his head slightly, still detached. "You didn't just leave the city. You left me to clean up a disaster at Mercer Holding. You ignored every call about the board crisis. And now," his eyes narrowed, "now I hear whispers about you and that designer from your firm. Ethan, right?" For a moment, I couldn't even speak. The air felt heavier than the marble around us. "You think I cheated on you?" He didn't answer. He just kept looking at me with that same cold calm, the kind people use when they've already decided what's true. Behind him, a young woman stood quietly, Mara, his assistant. She used to greet me with warm smiles, but now she avoided my eyes completely. Her hands were clasped in front of her, her body angled slightly behind Cole's shoulder, like she wanted to disappear. It wasn't just the accusation that broke something inside me, it was how polished he was. There was no anger, no confusion, just precision. Every word felt like it had been scripted by a lawyer. I took a small step closer, my voice shaking. "Who told you that? Who's been filling your head with this garbage?" He didn't blink. "People talk. I listen." That was when I knew this wasn't a sudden decision. The calm, the distance, the accusations, it was all preparation. He'd been setting this up long before I ever left for Boston. I looked at him one last time, realizing the man I loved had turned into someone I didn't recognize, and for the first time, I was truly afraid of what he was planning next. The next week felt like falling through glass. I found a small sublet in Brooklyn, one room with creaking floors and a window that barely shut. The air smelled of dust and someone else's cooking, but it was all I could afford. My life had been gold and marble once. Now it was chipped paint and silence. Every night I sat by the window with my phone in my hand, scrolling through old messages from Cole that no longer made sense. I hired a lawyer named Grant Lewis, a calm man with gray hair and sharp eyes. He spoke in short, careful sentences, like each word was a warning. The first time we met, he slid a folder across the table and said, "You need to see this." Inside were copies of contracts I'd never signed, agreements I didn't remember approving, and signatures that looked eerily like mine. He explained it piece by piece, his voice steady while mine trembled. Cole had been moving everything, properties, accounts, even the art in our condo, into companies registered under different names. All of it done while I was in Boston, sitting beside my father's hospital bed. I stared at the pages until the letters blurred. He used that time, I whispered. Grant didn't answer. He didn't have to. Each discovery cut deeper. The joint accounts we'd built were emptied. The investment portfolios he'd promised were ours were suddenly listed as Mercer Holding. And the condo, our home, wasn't legally mine at all. My name had been replaced months ago with a quiet amendment I'd never seen. Grant told me the building itself was valued at $100 million. I laughed without meaning to. It sounded obscene, like someone had stolen a city and left me with a closet. That night I sat on the floor, surrounded by boxes that weren't mine, staring at the blank wall of the sublet. Every memory of Cole replayed in fragments. The dinners, the laughter, the way he used to take my hand and promise we were equals. Those words had been hollow all along, rehearsed just like his lies in the lobby. I realized then that this wasn't just betrayal. It was strategy. Every move, every smile, every signature had been planned. While I was saying goodbye to my father, he'd been quietly erasing me from my own life. I pressed the papers to my chest, not to hold on to them, but to remember how it felt to lose everything. Days blurred together in that tiny apartment until one morning I couldn't stand the not knowing anymore. I pulled my old laptop from a box and opened every email account I still had access to. Most of them were dry business exchanges, but buried in the archives were hints. Messages from Cole's partners, scheduling notes from his assistant, receipts forwarded from his personal address. I started building a trail, one transaction at a time. There were things I hadn't noticed before. Credit card charges from places I didn't recognize. Restaurants uptown I'd never been to. Designer boutiques I'd never shopped at. Hotel stays that didn't match any of his business trips. The same pattern repeated again and again, always paired with the same initials. MR. I stared at those letters for a long time, the air thick around me. When I reached the line for a luxury wellness resort in upstate New York, something in me went still. The charge was recent. Too recent. I copied the number and dialed. A woman answered in a bright, professional tone. I told her I was calling from Mr. Mercer's office to confirm his next visit. My voice barely shook. Oh yes, of course, she said warmly. Mr. and Mrs. Mercer are scheduled for the weekend suite again. Would you like me to email the itinerary? The phone nearly slipped from my hand. I'm sorry, I said slowly. Could you repeat that name? Mrs. Mercer, she said without hesitation. Mara Mercer. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The name spun in my head, hitting every nerve like an echo I'd been trying not to hear. Mara, his assistant, the woman who'd stood behind him in the lobby, silent and obedient, the one who wouldn't meet my eyes. I ended the call, staring at my reflection in the dark screen. There it was, the truth I'd been circling around without wanting to see. He hadn't just betrayed me, he'd replaced me. I spent the rest of that night tracing their story through numbers and time stamps. Dinners billed for 2, flight confirmations with matching seats, transfers to her account labeled consulting fees. It all fit too perfectly. By dawn, the laptop was still glowing on the kitchen table, a graveyard of receipts and lies. The man I'd loved had written me out of his life and rewritten her in my place. And somewhere, in that glittering penthouse I once called home, they were already living the life I'd built. The invitation came from an old colleague who didn't know what had happened between us. It was a fundraiser at the Grand Orion Hotel, one of the buildings Cole's company had developed. I wasn't planning to go, but something in me needed to see him, to look him in the eye without the filter of lawyers or rumors. I put on a simple black dress and walked into that room full of glittering people who had no idea they were standing inside a lie. The moment I saw him, the air shifted. Cole was at the center of it all, laughing, shaking hands, the perfect image of success. His new shadow, Mara, stood close by, her hand resting lightly on his arm as if she'd always belonged. I could feel eyes turning when I stepped closer, whispers tightening the air. Cole noticed me halfway through a conversation and froze for half a breath before his smile returned. Laura, he said, as if greeting an old friend. You look well. I'd say the same, I replied, forcing a calm I didn't feel. Seems like you've recovered fast. He chuckled softly, his eyes scanning the crowd instead of me. We all have to move forward. You're still taking things too personally. Relationships fall apart. It happens. Does replacing someone before the funeral count as moving forward? I asked, my tone steady. For the first time, something flickered behind his polished mask. Annoyance, maybe even panic, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. You're overreacting, he said lightly. We drifted. People change. It was almost convincing, the way he said it. Almost. Across the room, a man I recognized from Cole's old business trips, Dean Carver, was watching us. The moment our eyes met, he looked away, pretending to study the wine in his glass. There was tension in his jaw, a tightness that didn't match the relaxed tone of the party. Cole noticed my glance and followed it. For the first time all night, the confidence slipped. "Dean's been under pressure," he said quickly. "Big projects, deadline." His voice was too casual, his smile too practiced. I leaned in slightly. "Is that what this is about? Pressure? Or is there something else you don't want seen?" His hand tightened around his glass. He didn't answer. The music swelled, covering the silence between us, but I'd already seen it, the small tremor in his composure. Beneath the surface charm, there was fear. And that fear told me his empire wasn't built on success at all. It was built on secrets. I stopped trying to sleep. Nights were spent at my small kitchen table, surrounded by piles of papers and my laptop's pale glow. The anger had gone quiet, sharp, focused, useful. I reached out to a few old contacts from the architecture firm where I'd once worked, people who still owed me favors or at least remembered I'd never betrayed them. I told them I needed access to records tied to Mercer development, permits, blueprints, internal files. Nothing too obvious, just enough to follow the trail. At first, it was routine data, project budgets, site plans, contract approvals. But as I compared them, the numbers stopped adding up. Construction permits for towers that never broke ground. Millions allocated to consulting under anonymous subcontractor. The same signature approving every transfer, Cole's. He'd been building ghosts, not skyscrapers. I kept digging, cross-referencing addresses, tax documents, vendor lists. One name repeated across multiple files. Companies that didn't exist outside of digital. They were shells, placeholders for money that had vanished the moment it was spent. I traced the paper maze until one entry hit harder than the rest. The penthouse condo. Our condo. The blueprints listed it as part of a philanthropic housing initiative, a project supposedly designed to provide community fun. The ledger showed millions marked as donations, yet the unit had been sold privately for 10 times its declared value. It wasn't real development, it was cover. The home that once felt like mine had been part of a lie from the start. I printed everything, page after page, until my floor was buried in evidence. The more I uncovered, the more deliberate it became. Cole wasn't just protecting himself. He was feeding an entire network built on fraud. Investors thought they were financing city projects, but he'd been routing their money through fake contracts and offshore accounts. Every dollar washed clean through those buildings. Sitting there in the dim light, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I wasn't powerless anymore. For the first time since he'd locked me out, I had something he couldn't control, the truth. I gathered the files into neat stacks, labeled each folder, and backed up everything twice. His empire looked unshakable from the outside, but now I could see the cracks spreading beneath the glass. He thought I was broken, finished, erased. But he'd built his fortune on foundations just as fragile as the lies he told me. All I had to do was push. I spent days buried in legal forms, scanning through lines of small print that blurred together until one phrase stopped me cold. It was buried deep inside a property registry update, an amendment filed months earlier, supposedly removing my name from ownership of the condo. Only it wasn't complete. The transfer had been signed by Cole, but the witness signature was missing. The assistant's error had left a trace, one the system hadn't caught. On paper, I still held 5% of the property. A fraction, but enough to open the door. That discovery set my pulse racing. I printed the document, folded it carefully, and slipped it into my bag like a key to something sacred. For once, I wasn't sneaking into his world. I was reclaiming what still legally belonged to me. I waited until I knew he'd be gone. His calendar, still linked to an old shared drive, showed a 3-day trip to Chicago. When night fell, I dressed in black, took the subway back to Manhattan, and walked toward the tower I hadn't seen since the night he shut me out. The building shimmered with its usual arrogance, glass catching every city light. The doorman had changed, but the system recognized my name when I presented the document. His hesitation was brief. The law was on my side. The elevator ride felt endless. When the doors opened, I was met with silence and the faint hum of air conditioning. The scent hit first, his cologne, the same one that used to linger on my clothes. Every surface gleamed. The place looked staged, as if frozen in time for someone else's life. I walked slowly through the rooms, the sound of my footsteps echoing. The walls were filled with art I'd helped him choose, now rearranged to erase any sign of me. On the kitchen counter sat 2 glasses, a bottle of wine half full. I didn't have to guess who had been there. I set my bag down and began working. Every drawer, every folder, every hidden compartment became part of my search. Laptops, flash drives, contracts, anything that could expose him went into a neat pile. I photographed files, scanned receipts, and backed up hard drives. Hours passed before I finally stopped in the bedroom doorway, looking out at the skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city glowed, indifferent and alive. I stood there, surrounded by everything he thought he'd stolen, and realized I'd just stepped back into his empire not as a victim, but as the one who would end it. The click of the door behind me froze my hands mid-motion. I turned, and there he was, standing in the entryway, suitcase still in hand. Cole wasn't supposed to be home for 2 more days. His eyes moved over the room, the open drawers, the scattered papers, and then found me. The mask of charm slipped for just a second before he forced it back on. "Well," he said quietly, setting the suitcase down, "I didn't expect a welcome party." I straightened, my heart pounding but my face calm. "You shouldn't be surprised. I still have a right to be here." He smiled, thin and dangerous. "You really don't. You should leave before this gets worse." "I'm not going anywhere," I said. "Not until I'm done." He took a slow step forward, his gaze flicking to the files spread across the table. "You've been busy," he murmured. "Did you really think you could understand my business from a few stolen documents?" "Stolen implies they belong to you," I replied evenly. "You might want to check the ownership records again." He laughed softly, but there was no warmth in it. "You think you're clever. You have no idea what you're playing with. There are things you don't know, things that could bury you right alongside me." The threat landed like ice in the room. I didn't move, didn't blink. "I know more than you think," I said. "The offshore accounts, the fake developments, the charity fronts, the woman pretending to be your wife. I know it all." That wiped the smirk from his face. "You don't have proof," he said, but the words lacked certainty. I let the silence hang for a moment before I spoke again. "You're right. I don't need proof. Someone else already has it." He frowned, confusion flickering into fear. "What are you talking about?" "I had a meeting last week," I said softly. "A federal investigator, Financial Crimes Division. They were very interested in Mercer Development's charitable project." The color drained from his face. His composure cracked, just enough for me to see the panic underneath. "You wouldn't." "I already did," I cut in. "They'll contact you soon." For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then I picked up my bag, walked past him, and reached for the door. "Laura," he said quietly, voice almost pleading now, "you don't know what this will do." I looked back once. "Yes, I do." And I walked out, leaving him standing there in the home that was about to destroy him. The headlines started small, just whispers in the business section about an internal audit at Mercer Development. Within days, they grew teeth. Financial irregularities, misused investor funds, luxury properties under investigation. I didn't need to read beyond the first lines to know what was happening. The dominoes were falling exactly as I'd expected. Each morning brought a new headline, each sharper than the last. Cole's photo was everywhere, walking out of a courthouse, jaw tight, surrounded by lawyers. Commentators debated how a man with everything could lose it all so fast. I sat in a quiet cafe across from the tower, coffee cooling beside me, watching the reflection of his empire unravel in us. Mara vanished first. The papers called it travel abroad, but I knew better. She'd run. No one could find her, not even the reporters who waited outside her building. Cole stood alone now, his allies turning into ghosts the moment the subpoenas arrived. Every name tied to him started to sink. I never received a call from investigators again. My meeting had been sealed off under confidentiality. They didn't need me anymore. The evidence spoke for itself. Still, messages found their way to me through mutual acquaintances, offers disguised as settlements, and signed letters promising quiet money if I withdrew anything I might have said. I deleted them without reply. Silence was worth more than any bribe. One gray afternoon, I walked back to the neighborhood I used to call home. The condo stood like a monument stripped of purpose, its windows dark, the marble lobby cordoned off by federal agents. Moving trucks lined the street, workers hauling out furniture I'd once chosen, art that had hung behind his staged smile. Each crate felt like a chapter being erased. From my table in the cafe, I could see the agents sealing the entrance, the last remnants of his name being peeled from the directory. People passing by barely looked up. The fall of a powerful man was already yesterday's news. But for me, it was the quiet ending to a storm I'd lived inside too long. I didn't gloat. I didn't cry. I just watched. The man who had locked me out now had nowhere left to stand. His empire, his wealth, even his name gone. The condo that once symbolized his success now belonged to the government, emptied and hollow, just like him. My revenge didn't need noise. It was finished the moment he lost everything. Morning light stretched across the street as I stood at the edge of the sidewalk, staring up at the tower that had once been mine. The windows were bare now, the curtains gone, the nameplate over the entrance removed. It looked smaller somehow, ordinary, stripped of the illusion it used to hold. For the first time, I wasn't seeing it as a place I'd lost. I was seeing it for what it really was, a cage I'd already outgrown. In my pocket, the old key pressed against my fingers. I hadn't realized I still carried it until that morning. It was the same one I'd tried to use the night he locked me out, the one that refused to turn. For months it had sat unnoticed in a drawer, tucked away like a piece of another life. Now it felt heavy, more symbolic than metal, a reminder of everything he once controlled and everything I'd taken back. The street was quiet except for the low hum of traffic a few blocks away. The city moved on, indifferent to the ruins of Cole Mercer's empire. Workers passed by without glancing up, their reflections flashing briefly in the glass. To them, it was just another building. To me, it was the grave of a story that had finally ended. I walked closer to the entrance, the air cold against my skin, and paused beside the marble steps. The revolving doors were locked, sealed with a notice from the government. Through the glass, I could still see the outline of the lobby desk, empty and dusted with sunlight. I remembered every moment that had happened there, every betrayal, every cruel smile, and felt nothing. No hatred, no sadness. Just stillness. I took the key from my pocket and turned it over in my palm. The metal caught the light, reflecting faintly against the gray pavement. For a second, I thought about keeping it, maybe as proof that I'd survived. But holding on would mean I still needed a connection, and I didn't anymore. I crouched beside the curb, the drain cover cold beneath my hand, and let the key slip through the opening. It hit the metal below with a soft, final sound and disappeared. The weight I'd carried for too long went with. When I stood again, the sun had climbed higher, warming the concrete. I looked one last time at the building, then turned away. Each step felt lighter, freer. The locks were gone, the lies buried, and for the first time in years, I belonged entirely to myself. Hey besties. Thanks for sticking with me till the end of this wild story. Imagine coming home from your father's deathbed only to find your husband locking you out of a $100 million condo. Painful doesn't even cover it, but revenge? That's power. Sometimes losing everything helps you find yourself again. If you liked this story, don't forget to like, share, drop a comment, and subscribe for more. See you next time.